you can start by just telling us what is a UTI.
Definition, yes. Urinary tract infection is an infection of any part of the urinary tract. You could have the infection being on the kidneys, you can have the infection in the ureters, you can have the infection in the bladder, you can have the infection in the urethra. Generally, that is what we refer to as a urinary tract infection. And because the symptoms mostly relate to the bladder, most people think the urinary tract infection is an infection of the bladder only, but it can be an infection of any part of the urinary tract. It affects people in different ways. It's interesting that urinary tract infections are thought to be a gynae issue because urinary tract infections affect females more. But there's an anatomical reason why women have more tendency of getting urinary tract infections. That's because they have a shorter urethra. The female urethra is about 4 centimeters, while the male urethra is 25 centimeters.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It's a big difference, indeed, 5 times more. And so the bacteria, because urinary tract infections are necessarily acquired from the outside, and bacteria crawl backwards into the urinary tract. So if you have the exit of the genitalia and you have bacteria climbing, if you're going to climb 4 centimeters, it's much easier for you as a bacteria as opposed to 25 centimeters, bearing in mind that the body will also mount its own defense against these infections.
Okay. Now, do we have specific UTIs for men and others for women, or are we generally affected by the same?
Actually not. Urinary tract infections affect both genders in the same way, except, like I said, that there is a bigger preponderance of infections in females, but we do have infections in males. The only thing that is important to know is that in males, when you get infections, there is usually an anatomical problem. Either there is obstruction to urine outflow, or there is a foreign body in the urinary tract, or there is a predisposing patient factor like diminished ability to fight infections, like happens in diabetics and other people who have otherwise been immunocompromised. So there has to be something wrong with the urinary tract in males to develop infections, and particularly in young children, in boys. When you start seeing urinary tract infections in boys, you think of the possibility of an obstruction to urine outflow, some congenital things mostly, but you can also have acquired reasons for developing urinary tract infections. In females, you can have urinary tract infections without any obvious anatomical problem, but even there, it's good to look for anatomical problems, because you may find anatomical reasons for patients having urinary tract infections. The key thing is to differentiate between having to pass urine frequently, which sometimes we find in this country gets mistaken for urinary tract infection. Urinary tract infections do present with having to go to the toilet many times, but there are other reasons why women would go to pass urine frequently other than urinary tract infections. And to treat all of this with an antibiotic panacea is the wrong way to go. And treating infections without really knowing that it is an infection can actually do more harm to the patient than help the patient. If, for instance, we have a situation called the overactive bladder, and in the overactive bladder, the bladder is just pushing more. It's a neurogenic problem of the bladder, and treating it with an antibiotic doesn't does that even solve the problem? It doesn't solve the problem at all. So I think the one key problem is sometimes people getting over-the-counter treatment, because unfortunately in Kenya, pharmacists and other people who relate with drugs are allowed to sell drugs, or not are allowed, but end up selling drugs over the counter, and that has serious consequences to the people who take them, because they take them without due regard for what should be. So a urinary tract infection must be proven, to be what specific bacteria, if you can, and we should only treat with an antibiotic that is likely to hit the bug that is causing the infection. Imagine, for instance, you have tuberculosis, urinary tract infection, and you treat it with the ordinary antibiotics. Even if you drowned the patient in antibiotics, the infection wouldn't go away. So it's very important that it be proven. And there are various stages of how you go about treating, making a diagnosis of urinary tract infection, starting from the history with the patient, how what does the patient present with. Going to the next thing is the physical examination. We find areas of tenderness, particularly the bladder, and then you need to do investigations. Investigations including, yes, the culture of bacteria in the urine, but also including looking at anatomical problem. For instance, doing a urinary tract ultrasound of the bladder and the kidneys may tell you why the patient is developing urinary tract infection.